So that's the title, and I don't even know what that means. Mark Harrison made up the title. So, as Omar said, I draw everything from medical stuff. These are a few examples of things I drew. In my day job, if you don't know, I am what's called a biomedical equipment specialist. That is, I take care of medical equipment, and my specialty is critical life support equipment, anesthesia machines, ICU ventilators, physiological monitoring. But occasionally I have need in my day job to use SketchUp. The yellow booms here were, I drew those to show how some equipment was going to new coming equipment was going to interact with stuff that was already in the room and how it would affect patient flow and that sort of thing. And these devices over on the side, this is actually the surgical or the anesthesia equipment services head, which was right in this area. And we convinced the manufacturer to change their layout to suit our needs for this, and by giving them a SketchUp model, I was able to, or give them the views from the SketchUp model, I was able to tell them very clearly, this is what we want. And after a little back and forth, they finally agreed. Now this is the only anesthesia services head they sell to other customers. So that's my day job. The SketchUp stuff started out as a hobby, and it turned into a second business. My key client is Fine Woodworking magazine, and I do plans for projects that are featured in the magazine. So if you, for example, this cabinet is in the current issue of Fine Woodworking, and this is the first page of the digital copy of the plan. I actually create two copies from the same SketchUp model that they sell. And so there's that. I do some other design work for tutorials or SketchUp modeling. These are things that were covered in this book that Omar referred to. This is Advanced Techniques, the ebook. These were drawn to show how to use some tools and create some more complex shapes in SketchUp. And then I do some stuff just for my own enjoyment. You'd think after all the SketchUp stuff, I kind of want to get away from it, but Saturday mornings I wake up early and the family is asleep, and so I poke around on the internet and find something to draw and draw it, and these were all drawn from photographs of existing pieces of furniture. But whenever I'm working in SketchUp and drawing a model, I'm thinking about making it as accurately as possible. And I also think about how I'm going to draw this thing so that it can be changed if needed. I'm probably preaching to the choir when I'm saying things like the accuracy starts with your template and the units that you use. I tend to work in fractional units still. I'm kind of an old guy for that. But I set my precision at a 64th of an inch, even though there's no way in the world I'm going to work to that in the shop. Nobody's going to cut wood to the nearest 64th. By the time they get done cutting it, it will have probably changed dimension anyway, just due to environmental issues, humidity changes and things like that. But this is kind of an important thing when you're setting up SketchUp, to set a template that makes sense for the stuff you're drawing. 64th of an inch might be a little overkill for architectural projects, but if your precision is set to the nearest foot, you might be inducing errors that can become cumulative and then become a problem. Not too long ago, I had a guy send me this model. And he couldn't figure out why all his dimensions were 0, because clearly they aren't, and they all ought to be at least a little different. And it turned out that he had his units set to feet and his precision set to the nearest foot, and he had units turned off so they wouldn't display, so he didn't even know that that was feet that it was displaying. And this thing is only about 3/4 of an inch long. The longest dimension is only about 3/4 of an inch, so SketchUp reports what it's told to report, and it worked. It was doing what it was supposed to do, but that kind of confused him. I learned long ago to start using keyboard shortcuts really intensively, and I've worked out sort of a standard workflow, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But every model basically starts the same way, and I use the same process all the way through. And I enter precise dimensions when I have to enter precise dimensions. I don't just drag something out to where it looks right and try to move the cursor until I get the dimension I want. I actually type those into the measurements box. But I also don't enter dimensions if I don't have to. And again, I'll show you what that means here in a moment. When I drew this workbench, for example, this was actually drawn for Fine Woodworking for their Tools and Shops issue at the end of last year. And the way I start the model is, any model, if it's got legs, the front left leg is the first thing I draw. And it gets made into a component, and then I copy it over to make the right front leg. And then I copy them to the back, and flipping them as a mirroring operation. And they're always components. I know a lot of people like to use groups, and that's fine, and I'm not going to tell anybody that they shouldn't, but I only use components. Every single part that I would draw in a model will become a component. I could go on, probably do a whole presentation for a couple of hours probably on why I only use components, but each one gets to be a component. After I've got the legs placed, if they're placed accurately, all I have to do is fill in the space in between. So the length of these apron, the bottom rails and the apron that's up underneath the top, I don't care how long that is, it just has to fit. And I can draw that by drawing the end section of the apron on one leg and using push-pull, and pull it over and use the other leg as the inference for the length. So this methodical approach that I use is really a powerful thing. And I see a lot of models from other people, because I do a lot of teaching of SketchUp. I see models from people every week where they're not working precisely and they're inducing problems into their models. They don't move things accurately. They're not entering numbers. They're not using what they've already drawn as references for the next thing they're going to draw. So the other thing that I've found that's really useful in making accurate models that are also easy to work with is to fix issues as they come up. Face orientation, for example. There are operations that will create reversed faces. This is the bottom of a turned leg. That's the bottom section in this particular leg is made in 3 pieces and then glued together. Green is the back face color that I've set for my standard back face color instead of that blue. Some of the computers that I use, that blue back face color looks much like the shaded white faces, if the face isn't oriented directly at the camera. And it can be difficult to tell whether it's a reverse face or it's just shaded. with the green, this is a green I would never use, well, I shouldn't say never, but almost never use on a model. So if I see that face color, I will fix that. So after a follow me operation, it's not unusual to have the geometry inside out, the faces inside out. So the next step would be to reverse the faces and correct that orientation so I have the white faces out. But if you do that as you go along, it saves you a lot of work down the road. And reverse faces can cause problems for some tools. Push-pull, for example, is a normal direction dependent tool. Depends on which side of the face you click on to get the when you are extruding the shape. Some rendering applications, even if you texture a back face, it will show as black, and not even black like you painted it black, but black as in there's nothing there, empty space. And I think not all renderers do this anymore, but a lot of them still do, and that causes problems. You know, something you've modeled and the faces are all reversed and it doesn't show up in your rendered image. That can be a problem. So, you know, fixing those kinds of things, stray geometry, get rid of it. When I'm working on projects, I'm depending on the bounding box for the component to be accurately and tightly fitted to the component that I'm making. So, because I will run a cut list from the model, if there's stray geometry, anything in there that makes the bounding box not fit correctly, I'll get an inaccurate dimension from the cut list because it reports the size of the bounding box. I kind of already alluded to this, but I draw in place as much as I can. So again, once I put the legs in for this model, for example, then I drew this apron to fit in between. In the case of this desk, I had a couple of photographs. That's one of them. I had a couple that showed the inside of the underneath the hinge top, and I had some overall dimensions, and that's all I had to work with to create this SketchUp model. But I didn't need to know a lot. I could figure out the legs. I kind of eyeballed the cross-section dimension, but all the rest of the stuff is just, again, I put on the legs and I build everything to fit. And you don't need as much information as you think you might. Certainly as you'd have, if I'd drawn the apron, for example, away from the model, I'd have to know how long it was to make sure it would fit, and I'd have to enter that number. By drawing in place, I saved myself a ton of work. And I frequently get, when I get models from, or plans from Find Woodworking to create plans from, I will get some of the dimensions. Some of the dimensions I can't read because it's very often pencil drawing that's been scanned and turned into a JPEG that's then been emailed to me, and you know, a lot of those lines and the dimensions drop out in the scanning process, so I have to do a little bit of investigative work, or you know, kind of feel like I'm a detective sometimes when I'm working there. But I'm always using what I've already drawn as a reference. I mentioned earlier that I use components. There's so many ways you can leverage those. Of course, you save components out for reuse. If you properly locate the component's origin and its axis orientation, it makes it very easy to drop them in. The other thing that I do, even from the beginning, is I kind of think ahead about what I'm doing and what the tools are going to do. Has anybody ever tried to make like a quarter column or a quarter something with follow me using an arc as the path. And you get kind of a weird result if you use that arc. And it's because follow me wants the profile to be perpendicular to the first segment in the path. And it will end with the end of the profile perpendicular to the last segment in the path. Well, if you draw an arc, the first segments are not going to be on axis if it's, say you draw that off the center or off the origin. But if your profile is aligned with an axis line and it's 15 degrees or 7.5 degrees on that first segment, the follow me tool is going to project that profile. And it doesn't even rotate it, it projects it, and that changes the shape. But it makes a lot of work to clean up if you're going to do that. If you use a circle, for example, and rotate that circle after you've placed it. In fact, let me see if I can demonstrate that real quickly here.
What do you mean by don't get behind the model?
Well, this is kind of what I'm talking about, is you need to be able to anticipate what the tools are going to do and what you're going to need to do with the tools. When you, what's the next step down the road? It's kind of like if you're trying to cross a river on rocks and you're not looking far enough out, you get out in the middle of the river and you're standing on a rock, and now where do you go? And you can't find your way back because you don't know which rock you just came off of. And how do you get out of that? So staying ahead of the model is, when I was learning to fly, my flight instructor said, stay ahead of the plane. It's not a good thing to land 30 seconds after the airplane's already on the ground and rolling out. It's kind of the same thing. When you're driving, you always have some place to go. You don't want to get yourself boxed in. And it's the same thing, I think, when you're working on a SketchUp model. Another thing, I don't know why I can't even get my toolbar up here to open SketchUp, so I'll leave that for later. But another thing is to think ahead about what you're going to need from the model. When I drew this model originally, this part here and this whole rail that runs under here didn't exist as that's an accessory that's now available for that machine. It didn't exist at the time. I drew this machine for the Router Boss developer. The machine is called the Router Boss, and I drew it for assembly instructions and setup instructions for how to use it for different woodworking projects. Every single component is modeled, or every single part is modeled as a component. And so this thing can be disassembled. I can show it in various configurations, and anticipating that there were going to be changes down the road or additions. I made it so that I could easily work on it and move parts around and that sort of thing. There's a lot of detail that won't show necessarily in a given view, but it's there and available. I even got to the point where I drew the scales on the sides here, and actually these are hard to see, but these are scales that are marked off in millimeters. Those were drawn in SketchUp, and they're accurate to the millimeter, so that I can even work with the dimensions of the model. Everything is accurate, like I say, to the parts, the real parts. But by thinking ahead and assuming that I was going to have to change things, it makes it much easier to set up the model in the first place. And so don't kind of think about, well, I just need this now. Think about where you're going to go. Another example of that is, this is a sideboard. These are initial design drawings for this sideboard for a client. This was actually, I just drew this a couple of weeks ago. The one on the left was my first iteration, and he thought, after I submitted it to the furniture maker, he thought he wanted a frame and panel arrangement. So I did this, but it was easy because I had used components throughout the model. So editing one end of the panel on this end gave me the panel on the other end. They're copies of the same component. So all I had to do was edit one of them. It took me maybe 5 minutes to make that change and create a new image to send to him. I mean, that was from getting the email to having something to send back to him, because I had drawn the model. Now this model is, at this stage here, is totally hollow inside. There is no internal structure at this stage, and there's not much point in having that when you don't even know if the design is right. But this was enough to give him the idea. And this was the design, the final design. He decided he didn't like the frame and panel on the ends, and he wanted a shallower curve. You can't really tell in this image, but he wanted a shallower curve on the top and the drawer fronts. So I reduced that, flattened that curve out. All of that was very quick. Took me longer to paint the materials on here than it did to make the modifications to the model, because of the way I'd used components. Yes?
You use symmetry a lot in your components, like Eric splitting a lot of his tabletop?
No, I don't. He's got kind of a neat arrangement where and for those who maybe didn't see what Eric did with his that open desk table, the maker table, he split his components down the center line, so it's really only half the component that's been copied and flipped, and then if he makes a change to one side, the change happens on the other. That's really cool if all you need it for is looks, but the Cutlass extension reads the bottom level components, so it would report that piece that was split. It would report it as two pieces that are half as long as the total, and so it wouldn't give an accurate dimension. I sometimes will start that way, but eventually that component would get exploded so that it becomes one unit to create the symmetry. It depends on how hard now in the case of his, to be honest with you, I probably wouldn't have done that, because it's not that difficult to draw a couple of angled lines down or move those points. You know, if you decide you want to change the angle like he was showing, you could just move one and then move the other the same distance. If it was a very complex curve, I'd be more likely to draw one half of it and copy it and flip that copy. But there is symmetry, however, because in this, my texture for the doors, the door panels, shows a book match thing. And to do that, I just draw a line down the middle to divide the door panel and paint the material, and then I can flip it on one side, and then I hide that line that I've drawn, that edge, and so you get that book match thing. And in this case, because this was still kind of a quick thing, the doors are all identical because it's the same component, just copied across. Even the drawer fronts, this little, I don't know if it shows back there, but you can see this little dip in the dark part of the grain. Those drawer fronts are just mirrored copies of each other. So the two outer ones are the same component, and the two middle ones. From the standpoint of editing this to flesh out the interior, that makes it very easy because I only have to do, because the drawer fronts are curved and they are actually at different angles, I'll have to draw the drawer boxes for two drawers, but I only have to do two because the other two will get done automatically because they're components. So that's a pretty easy process there. These are a couple of models that I did just for my own. Well, actually, the one on the right, the orange chair, the short one was done as a tutorial for a fellow in Brazil. But I decided to make a taller version of it, more of a stool. And because of the way I used components, it was only a matter of a couple of minutes to make the taller version. The chairs and the table on the left are some Danish pieces from around 1960. And I found the table first, just poking around online, and drew it. And then later I came across the chair, pictures of the chairs, and realized that they use the same components. So by transferring the components from the table, copying them over, I could make the rails. Those are all the same components that are in the table, as are the armrests. They're the same components in the table. And the legs on the chairs are just modifications of the legs on the table. And looking at that, I realized that the manufacturer probably used the same logic that I used to make the model, which made it very easy for them to manufacture these chairs, mass produce these things, because most of the parts are the same. So rather than doing unique stuff. So that's kind of a handy way to work. You look at, when you're drawing things, see how can you use the same part again. These are a couple of pieces that I drew for that book, and the legs on this shaker sewing stand are the same legs as on the pie crust table. I just modified the leg component to fit the tea table. A little bit of scaling, a little bit of tweaking, but it's the same leg, so I didn't have to draw the whole leg again. Those legs aren't terribly hard to draw, but it's a little time consuming. So it's nice to be able to use them over again. Fortunately, in this case, I only needed to get those legs kind of close on the tea table, because the table was, the whole point of the table was really about drawing the pie crust on the top. Here's another example. The yellow screw was the original screw component that I created. And all of those other screws are sort of variations on the theme, but they all started out from that yellow screw, which is a number 8 by 2.5 inch long screw. I do have actually even more screws that I've created from that, but whenever I need a different screw, I pull that one out and I make, or whatever's closest to what I've got, what I need, and make the required modifications. For the most part, I wouldn't recommend drawing screws and including them in your models. There's a point, it's kind of a fine line of getting a return on your investment. So for the plans that I do for Fine Woodworking magazine, I have to show the screws, because you don't know who's going to be building the thing, and so you've got to show them where screws go. If it was a plan for me to use in my workshop, unless it was there was a possible conflict with the screw and something else or another piece of hardware, I wouldn't bother to put that in. I kind of know that, yeah, I'm going to need to hold these two pieces together with some screws, and I will use screws that fit, and I'll figure that out when I get in the shop. But the point is, you don't have to redraw something all the way from scratch, just make modifications to it. So between scaling and editing, the way I drew these screws, the threads are separate from the rest of the screw, so I can easily take out a chunk of the threads, or I can copy them to make them longer. Usually, I started with this longest screw, so it was easier to just delete threads that I don't need. But the rest of the screw,
You just draw like one revolution.
yep, and then I copied that up. So it's easy to add more, or take out, and they're little subcomponents. And I don't need these to be accurate so that they could be manufactured. That'd be kind of goofy. You can go buy them for a few cents, right? But so they just need to be representative of you know, and I think most people could look at those and know what I'm representing. Yes?
In these drawings, your shaft is the same size all the way up, whereas in reality that might not be true. Is that correct?
True. Yeah, and again, these are representative.
Yeah.
You know, you look at that and you know it's, that biggest one is a lag screw, and it doesn't have to be perfect. The thread does, if you look close, I kind of tried to hide some of that, but if you look up here at the, where the thread runs out, that's not the way they run out on the real screw. But they also don't get viewed that closely, so those things don't show, and it's not worth, you know, again, you got to find figure out the return on the investment. Is it a good investment to show accurately how the thread runs out, or does it make sense if you're doing like a kitchen layout? Does it make sense to have the internal stuff in the oven, or do you just need the front of the oven? You know, if it's going to be between some cupboards, do you even need the sides of the oven to show? Maybe you don't even need to model those. Maybe you need the front and the top and the backsplash thing, and you're good to go. There at least used to be some appliance components in the 3D warehouse that I'm sure you could reverse engineer and build a refrigerator from the model in the 3D warehouse, because it's got not only the racks inside, the shelves, the compressor and the all the plumbing are shown, and the motor and the wiring are all shown underneath the thing, and you know, it's not really an efficient model if all you're going to do is use it for to show a refrigerator in a kitchen layout. Probably your client wouldn't care if there was a compressor in it, as long as it works.
How many components do you have in the gold screw?
I don't know, I have to count the number of turns, but there will be, well, component instances, there's one for the bottom, because the last couple of turns are actually one component. It's a tapered helix. There's another component instance for the threads along the straight shaft, and then the rest of the screw body, the shank, and the head are all another component. Which makes it very easy. If I wanted to just make a screw without a shank out of that, I could open the screw body for editing, draw a selection box, drag a selection box around the head and move it down.
No, it won't take up too much time.
No.
That component is just like 180 degree thread, or is it a 360?
It runs 360 around the thing, so you can look at it from any angle, and it still looks like a screw.
Well, no, but I mean the component
Oh,
of the thread is a 180.
it's 360.
It is 360.
Yeah, so it's just easy to copy it up, and you don't have to do any rotating or anything. I'm getting kind of close to the end already, which I didn't think I was going to do. I thought I was going to be really long here. Using layers and scenes. The way I work with my models, because everyone is different, I create layers after I've created my assembled model. I'm going to show you one of my SketchUp models here in a layout file too. So I'll kind of show how that is. But I make while I'm modeling, I'm thinking about how I'm going to have to show the parts of the model in the plan, or in the in the presentation, if it's just a proposal or something for a client. And so I'm thinking about that for organizing, and then I assign layers when I get done. A cool trick I found for making the layers and making sure everything gets assigned to a layer is I create a scene of the assembled model, and then I create the layers, and I turn the visibility off for all of those layers. And then I go through the model and I make the layer associations with entity info, select the components. So select the legs, assign them to the legs layer, and they disappear. And I keep going until I've got a blank model space. Anything that might be left, if there were stray edges or something that I hadn't caught already, they get deleted, and I've got a clean model. And then I click on the scene tab I made, and all this the whole model comes right back. All right, 15 minutes, so questions, yes?
Just a quick question. I'm curious how, like, the front legs are mirrored, right?
Yes.
Like, it's not a through tenon. So do you make unique components in the situation where it's mirrored so that you know in the shop, like, this is the front left leg, this is the front right leg?
No, you can, I don't do it, but you can add so the name that you give to a component when you create it is a definition name. You can also add an instance name when you create when you edit the component. So you could put in, you could have leg, and then you could have front left, front right. They'd have different names on them. So you could do that if you wanted. I don't do that. And they stay related. So you can see that both of these legs select when I select them, indicating that they're related.
So when you say you're naming all your components, you're defining, you're putting it in defining?
I'm putting in a definition name. So components have a definition, and so that's all the stuff about the component. And then there's an instance name that you can use if you want. So you can kind of further refine the thing.
The instance name is a special name on the copy.
Exactly. Yeah, and it won't show up on the other copies. So you could have, if it was an architectural thing and you've got like double doors, you want to indicate this is the front, or this is the left door and here's the right door, you could do that. And they could still be the instances of the same component. So if you decide, okay, I'm going to put a window in the door, you can edit one of them and have the window show up in the other door as well.
Or in this case, you could, in putting the tenon in on one, it'll be reflected on the other.
Or the mortise, yes.
Mortise.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, because they stay related, the mortise in one gets done to the other. The downside of that is then when you go out to the shop to make the project, you still have to handle both legs and cut the mortise in both legs. I haven't figured that out for working in real life. Does anybody? Yeah.
As far as your precision goes in your units you set up at the beginning,
Mm-hmm.
how does that affect your dimensioning when you put out shop drawings?
It doesn't really. It doesn't. Well, so I use that 1/64th of an inch as a troubleshooting thing for my model. So when I run the cut list, I look through the dimensions and look for 64ths. I look for 64ths and a tilde. The tilde indicates it's an approximate dimension. But because I never intentionally make anything to a 64th of an inch, I don't expect to see them. But it's very quick then to use the cut list. Let's see if I can do that here real quick. So let me select that part of the model. And all right, there's the cut list thing. I'm not going to make the web page, and I'm just going to run this quick. And so now, okay, I get it. My jam nut should be in the parts section, and I haven't got that set up on this to make the nut show up there. But so it's got a goofy dimension. Okay, that's fine. I don't care about that one. But if I were to see my leg was 31 and 1/64th, that's going to raise a flag that, you know, maybe I better go back and look at that and find out why. So having that higher precision, if you have a lower precision setting, a coarser precision setting, you could have parts that are off, and you could develop or induce cumulative errors that actually do cause you problems. It might not be a problem if it shows it the leg is 31 and a 64th here. But what does that do to the relationship with other parts? And so I like to work at a higher precision than I would work in real life, so that I can catch those things and fix them, and I know that I'm not going to have induced cumulative errors. Any other questions?
On your bench,
Mm-hmm.
you
how do you handle, or do you address the distance from the bottom to the base of the top might be like a 1/4 inch higher if you just stacked all your doors up and measured the front face of all your doors, your tolerances?
Well, so what I do, and this is kind of driven by what Fine Woodworking has told me they want me to do. I don't leave gaps between my drawers. So the drawer height is exactly the same as the opening. And I do that because this plan might be used by somebody in Arizona where the humidity stays low pretty much all year round and there's little in the way of seasonal changes. Or it might be built by me in Minnesota where it can be 7% humidity in January, incredibly dry, and then 100% humidity in early August, and you get fairly large seasonal changes in the dimensions of the wood. So it's kind of up to the person building it to make the appropriate allowances for those gaps. But in a case like this, I was told how high the drawers were, so that's the space I use between the dividers. But those were drawn after the outside of the bench was drawn. So I didn't. So the drawers don't affect the height of the bench. You know, do you understand what I'm saying?
Are there extensions out there that address that if I wanted that?
Oh, like to leave those gaps? I don't know of any. It'd be kind of interesting to be able to say I'm using this species of wood and it's flat sawn, and so you'll get this much across the grain variation with this humidity change, and then let you figure out. You know, and it also depends if I were to build the bench in January, I'd want to leave a bigger gap than if I was building it in August. Yes?
What extensions would you have in your repertoire at your hand while you're doing this particular kind of project? Do you have an idea?
To be honest with you, I don't use an awful lot of extensions. One that I used fairly extensively, though, here is one called Trim and Keep. It's by Jim Foltz. It's available from the SketchUp plug-in store. It's a free download, but it's a modification on the trim tool from the Solid Tools set. It will only work in SketchUp Pro. Are you familiar with the Solid Tools? Yeah. So if a solid tool modifies a component, it converts it to a group and calls it difference. So it changes the name. It's not even the same name as the component had. And so any copies of that component they're now unrelated, and so they don't get the same thing done to them. Trim and Keep kind of fixes that and makes the modified component remain a component, and it modifies all the others, just like any other editing that you would do to a component. And so I manually draw the tenons on that bottom rail, and then I use Trim and Keep to make the tenon cut the mortise, so it's a perfect fit. Actually, technically, it's not right for woodworking because you probably want to make it slightly deeper, and if it's exactly the same size, you won't be able to get the tenon in there, or if you dry fit it, you won't get it out. But it's in the right place that way, so you don't have to do any layout. So that's one that I used rather extensively here. The other extensions that I commonly use are Fredo's Bezier spline tool and his round corner. I did use the round corner, I think, to make the radius on the foot for the dead man, but otherwise it's mostly the native tools. Yes?
What's the difference between the Bezier spline tool and the Bezier curve?
The Bezier spline set has a whole bunch of different curve drawing tools. I mostly use the Bezier curve tool out of that set, which is very similar to the one from the extension warehouse. It's just Bezier curve. The Freddos will allow you to adjust the number of segments that are used in the curve, and you can put in as many. Basically, you don't have to say in advance how many control points you want. You just click. So click 1 point, then click to add points, and then you can go back and edit that later. But you keep clicking, and when you're done setting control points, you just double click, and you're done. So there's no any entering numbers.
Question on your mortise on your legs.
Uh-huh.
Since you got two fronts, there are components. If you draw the mortise on one leg, does it put it on the wrong side of the other?
No, because the component is mirrored. It's
Oh, you
it's a
mirror, okay.
flipped. So if you look, you can. Right now we're looking at the model axes. If I open this for editing, you can see the orientation of the components axes. If I open this one, you'll see it's a mirror. I use flip along, and I set keyboard shortcuts for the flip along commands because I use them so frequently.
Okay. Related to the gentleman over here's question earlier, so let's say I knew the spacing that I wanted for my drawers. What would your process be if you wanted to go ahead and model,
Oh,
a
with the
30
gap?
second, a 30-second reveal or something like that?
The way I'd probably do that, and there have been a few times when I've done it, I just draw it to fit the full size. So I've already got the opening drawn, and so I'd use the rectangle tool and draw the rectangle,
Offset.
and then use offset and delete the outside edge, and then push pull and make it the thickness that you want. That's one quick way to do it, and it's easy to get the same reveal or the same gap all the way around. It's a little harder to get that same gap when in the shop.
Do you use layout for your shop drawings?
I do.
Do you dimension in SketchUp or do you dimension layout?
I dimension in layout. I dimension in layout, and let's see here. Oops, let me see if I can open that quick.
Did you try, what was your pros and cons for each way?
Right now, oops, just a moment. The downside of the dimension tool for in two pockets on this side of this pair of shorts, which I didn't know until yesterday. The downside of dimensions and this is, for me, is very minor, is that dimensions in layout don't respect the perspective in the model. Okay, here's the plan for that bench. This was actually drawn in layout 2015, so it's missing some things that they'll do now. But and let's see. Well, okay, I'll just do it this way. We'll go there. Well, so there's my cut list for this, and so, since it was such a long cut list, it's in here sideways. You'd have to turn the plan after you've printed it, but every part is listed there. I use an extension that I had TIG write for me that creates these labels. So one cool thing with layout is the auto text feature for various text entities, and one of those options with labels is to show the component description. So if you put a description in your component, you can have that automatically populate here in the label. I had TIG write this extension called Component Descriptor, which is also available in the 3D warehouse, or I'm sorry, in the SketchUp plugin store. So it automatically puts in the component name. It even puts in the comma You zoom in a little more so you can actually see that. It puts in the commas, the IN period, the words thick by, wide by, and long. It automatically does all of that in the component description. So I just click and put in a label, and I don't have to type anything there unless I have to add something like I did in this one. But it makes for very quick.
So layout is making this exploded view for you?
No, that exploded view was made in SketchUp, and I created a scene. Unfortunately, because of the way my screen resolution is, I can't show the scene tabs, but there's a specific scene that shows the exploded view.
Okay.
And so this is a viewport that's tied to that scene.
You import it.
I'm sorry?
Then you just import it.
Yeah. So you set the viewport to show that scene. And so I do all my scenes in SketchUp for all the viewports. And then it's just a matter of dropping those viewports in or setting the viewports up for each thing.
What's the name of that plugin again?
Component descriptor. Two hands at the same time.
So do you set up?
Okay.
Do you have all your parts in all those pages? Do you do all your individual parts? Project?
Yeah. So if we go to the next page, for example, these are the details for making the legs. The dashed lines and the breaks are put in layout.
Do you set scenes and layers for each thing?
Yep. So I'll turn off layers that I don't need to show, that aren't going to show up. So for example, the top and the drawers and the drawer dividers and stuff are not those layers are not turned on in SketchUp for the viewport. And in this case, this is the same viewport or same scene as the bottom one. I've just cropped them in layout so I could get rid of the middle section where there's nothing going on. It's not worth showing. So.
Yeah, that answers part of my question. Any guidance on laying out all the different scenes that you're going to do in SketchUp so that they don't interfere in layout?
It's not really too much of a problem if you're leveraging layers. So come on, let's go back here to this. So you can see I've got all this stuff here. I set the exploded view of the model. Generally, it's always to the right and back. And this is another one of those consistency and workflow things. But I do that because I'm going to end up having to make a right side view. Hey, there's my scene tabs now. But I'm going to end up making a 2D view, a parallel projection view of the right end, and so I don't want that to show up. When you're working in perspective, it's pretty easy to see if there's something intervening, something in between what you want to see and where the camera is. In the parallel projection, it's easy to get something in between that doesn't show up here, but it will show up in the in layout in the viewport, and so you have to kind of watch that. But you can see I've got parts that overlap here, but in their seams that go with those things, one layer is turned off and the other's on, so those things don't show up. So I'm controlling that visibility of showing only what I want to show for the scene. Any other questions? Or you all just want to go to lunch? Because, let's see, wait a minute, I got to show you my last slide. Oh, come on, do that. Oops. Oh, I'm sorry, this was another slide I had, just it kind of shows what I was showing with the bench. And there you go. So thank you. And if you've got questions later, feel free to ask. There's my email address, if you can see that. If you want to email me, I'm always happy to respond and that sort of thing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.